Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrickson, and welcome to Life Along the Merrimack. We talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River and the Merrimack River Valley. I am the outreach historian for the Custom House Maritime Museum, and I consider this podcast as part of reaching out. Frequently we have guests, but today I am going to be the sole presenter. One thing I want to talk about is fires as they relate to history. There's been many news outlets in the past few days have been talking about the death of a fire lieutenant during a blaze in Worcester. This is a great tragedy, and one that has such travail has existed just about as long as fire departments. Fires can be destructive to individuals and communities, of course. The history of Newburyport's downtown, as a matter of fact, was fashioned by fire. The Great Fire of 1811 was a major event in local history. It burned the wood structures in close to half of the downtown. City leaders went to state officials. They were basically broke. Almost every job in the town was lost. And they asked state officials for financial support in helping them to rebuild the town. Those on Beacon Hill said they would help, but only if the city rebuilt with brick. As a result, the present downtown is mostly brick. And the city has won awards because this brick architecture was preserved in the 70s. Some communities, including Haverhill and Gloucester, in my view, tore down venerable structures to develop new buildings and parking lots. This was a mistake. And I think Newburyport is known throughout the state as one of the communities, and this was early, this was the 70s, that decided to take federal money and save what they had rather than tearing down for new elements. The fire, though, lasted a very long time in the consciousness of Newburyport. And the Great Fire of 1811 is still referenced from time to time. A young Caleb Cushing wrote a short book around it in 1826. He later became the city's first mayor in 1851. He served in Congress, and he was the Attorney General. He was a leading candidate for president in 1856 and 1860, at least in the discussions around the spittoon. But abolitionists thought he was soft on slavery. So that was Caleb Cushing, and his home now houses a historic institute at 88 High Street. He wrote a book when he was only 26 about the Great Fire, and it's still in the archive at the Newburyport Library. But there is a footnote to the Great Fire, which is rather sad but unusual and quite well known even in the national way. In about 1820, a couple of teenagers were horsing around near a barn in the downtown of Newburyport. A fire started. The city panicked. And one teenage boy, he was 16, was arrested, even though no human lives were lost. He was tried, found guilty, and hung down in Salem. Now, today, if, just on the basis of starting a fire which injured no human beings, to hang someone of 16 years would seem quite unusual. But this happened in large part because so many of the people here in Newburyport were very skittish about fire. And he was kind of a ne'er-do-well. In fact, I read some testimony from his trial, and his father got up and said, I don't know what to do with him. I can't control him. He goes out, walks the streets with his friends at night. He hangs around with shady individuals. I don't know what to do. Now, I doubt if the father could perceive that hanging was in the cards, but indeed he was hung down, as we say in Salem. In later years, this hanging was discussed on the national level, and social workers, along with politicians, began a drive for more humane treatment for those under 18. And I think we can see that today. Some wild and crazy things happen with teenagers, but no one would think about hanging them after a brief trial. But as I say, there was much panic about fires in 1820 because it was less than a decade after the Great Fire of 1811. On the subject of fires, there was also a damaging blaze on the waterfront here in Newburyport in 1894. Factories burned on Merrimack Street in the area between Michael's Harborside and the Black Cow. And some of these made shoes, some of them made combs, but numerous people were made homeless, and then, of course, many jobs were lost. Also, in 1934, there was a big blaze here in Newburyport on Summer Street, across from the site of today's Andiamo restaurant. Scores were homeless. And since this was the depth of depression, the homeless really suffered. One event that created jobs in the 30s was the construction of Newburyport High School. They're not related, of course, but the building of the high school on what they called Mount Rural began in the mid-30s. And this was in the middle of the Depression, and people needed work. It took a number of years to build, of course. I think it opened in 1937. We still have much of the basic structure still intact. And everybody that I know who comes to town, and this happened to me the first time we drove through Newburyport, what a beautiful high school. As we know, additions have been made, roofs have been fixed, but the 1930s was the era when it was built, and it came at a good time after a big fire, and also at a time when there weren't too many jobs here in Newburyport. On the note of construction, this is a modern note, I noticed that a barn on Low Street has been torn down. It used to hold hay. It's on the way to the landfill out off of Low Street. And I suppose they'll be building apartments or condominiums there. At one point, it was going to be a dog park, which seems to make sense because about half the people in town happen to have dogs, and about half of those people complain about, there aren't enough places to let your dog run off the leash. I am not a dog owner, nor, I must say, in a lowered voice, a dog lover. But for a while, more than a year, Mayor Don Holliday had earmarked that to be a dog park where people could park their cars, let the dogs out on a leash, etc. Clearly, that is not going to happen, and new purposes are underway. But the barn came down, the construction people are there, and so we shall soon be seeing new building on Low Street. One of the things that happened recently in my own life and in the life of Life Along the Merrimack is that I was offered a book contract to write a book titled Life Along the Merrimack. The publisher's Fonthill Media, and that was started by an individual who started Arcadia Publishing and the History Press. They do hundreds of books per year, and you may have seen them. There's one of Old Newbury, there's one of Plum Island, there's one of Salisbury. I did several with this company. One was on the Franco-Americans of Maine. Another one was titled Nautical Newburyport. And a third book that I've written, but has not gotten near the press, is called New England Coast Guard Stories. I am very cranky that it has not gotten near the press. I sent everything in last December. It is now mid-November. That's 11 and a half months, and nothing has happened. But I am trying to be patient. I think a book on the New England Coast Guard will be interesting. And so I'm just hoping that it can start moving. They said it might be published in March, which would be a good thing. And one of the elements about that is, I'd want to talk about the history of the river. It started with the Native Americans, of course. They were the early settlers. I would go up as far as New Hampshire, towards Winnipesaukee Stream near Franklin, New Hampshire, because as we know, the 117-mile river travels through 2 states. And, I'd have quite a bit of the history. Several of the highlights of the history would include the period of large mills. In the early 1820s, technology developed hydropower. Now, it seems like an old trick to us now, but in those days, they were just learning how to capture the strength of a river, such as the Merrimack, and have it run not electrical, but run power machines. There was not much electricity at that time, so this is a way to power the looms and some of the other elements that made textiles, shoes, and many garments. And through the 1920s, buildings were created along the Merrimack River in Lowell. This went very well. And so from that, the engineers and actually entrepreneurs, we might call them, money men, decided, well, why don't we just build an enormous amount of mills in a community nearby, and they called it Lawrence. So as some of us know, Lawrence was built because of the mills. They built the mills, and as they say, if you build it, people will come. Anyway, a lot of people did come. At first, the workers were, quote, farm girls from the rural areas who might have been 15 to 20 or 25, most of them single. They would live in dorms or barrack-like structures right near the mills. They'd work a full day and go home at night. And this was, the plan was for them to work about 4 or 5 years. I mean, at that time, many girls wanted to get married, had their own homes, but this is one of the earliest elements in, gender history, if we can call it that, that girls got their own jobs, and I say girls, 15 to 20. They had their own apartments in many cases. They were owned by the factory, but nevertheless, they had their own apartments, and they created lives for themselves. Now, it was so successful, however, at least the Americans getting into the yarn and cotton market, that more people were needed. And the owners of the mills pressured Congress and national leaders to make it easier for people from overseas to emigrate to America. Now, this is quite different than it is today. But many people from Europe, from Russia, from Canada, French Canadians especially, came and filled the mills. And the money was not good, but it did, many of the, especially from Europe, were under great duress. They felt, if they stayed there, they'd either never get work, or there might be a pogrom or a bloodletting if they were Jewish or Gypsy or Polish or whatever. I think we all know that there were some bad times in Europe. So thousands came and worked in the mills. And one of the things that I like to dwell on is that women had an enormous role in the development of this part of the Merrimack River. And I think if you've read the local histories, women don't really appear in local history. And, they weren't captains of ships. They didn't run shipyards. Those were some of the big industries of Newburyport and other communities. But in the element of working in the mills, they were very successful. And beyond being successful, they were the first labor agitators. Now, I didn't fully realize this. Now, we know that there was a big strike in 1912 in Lawrence. It's called the Red Rose Strike. It's nationally known as one of the first labor movements in the country. This, of course, on the Merrimack River, which is our ongoing theme. But if you read the literature, a lot of women started organizing in 1850 and 1860, and they were basically saying, you can't give us more work, you can't cut our pay, or else, we won't come into work. Now, this isn't so well known. In fact, I didn't quite know about it. But there were women's groups in the 1850s and 60s who really wanted to improve their lot. One of the challenges of these women, however, is in most cases in Lawrence and Lowell, they lived in housing owned by the mill owners. And so if they went on strike, then the mill owner would evict them. If they, did something at work, if they walked off, then they might come back and find their apartment locked up. So it took a tremendous amount of courage and organization for these women. And again, it's 1850, 1860, which to me is quite amazing. But they did start a labor movement along the Merrimack River. And that continued, again, as we say, until 1912. I must say, one of the things that surprises me is we always read how bad the mills were, that it was low money, often dirty. But when I wrote a book about the Franco-Americans who worked in the mills in Maine, a number of them, said their recollection, and they would have been working in the 1920s or 1930s, their recollection was it wasn't that bad. One woman said they had daycare. Another fellow who'd worked there for 30 years said, well, it gave me a job. I did not have a job up in Quebec. And so I would come down in the winter. I'd work, 6 months throughout the winter, and then I'd go back to the family farm. I'd see my friends. I'd see my family. I'd help with the farm chores. So some people, at least with the French Canadians, found it very rewarding, and they made it work. Now, again, if you had come from Russia or from Poland and you immigrated here, or from Ireland, it was not easy to work 6 months and then go back to the homestead. Obviously, very few people could do that. But for the French Canadians, it worked. And I just remember, when I did that research, which is in the early 80s, I'm thinking, some people said, well, for the French Canadians, it actually worked pretty well. And it's another curious thing about the women in history is what different lives they lived. Now, that was what I've just been talking about, as 1850s to, say, 1890, when women were starting to organize. It came to fruition with the strike of 1912. But those were women who worked in the mills along the Merrimack. And life was different for women in Newburyport, for instance. I wanted to read a couple lines from a journal. This was written by Miss Sarah Emery in 1894. So this is about, at the same time, women in Lawrence and Lowell were figuring out how to get better working conditions and not get evicted. Some women in Newburyport lived a more sedate life, shall we say. The Emerys were, I suppose, an upper-middle-class family. They owned their house. But here are some of the things from Miss Sarah Emery's journal. This is August 1st, 1894. And I'll just read a couple of these. Sarah Chase arrived last night and made a short visit. Friday, the weather is delightful. Joe raked the weeds today, and Mr. McIntosh brought over his large amount of hay so that we could give the horses some feed. We picked some berries, and we took them to Sarah Condon. Then we picked some raspberries and took some clothing to them. The girls, Sam and Sarah Chase, have gone to see the Browns tonight. So that was a nice day. August 2nd, this a.m., Miss Ellen Poor called and stayed until nearly 12 o'clock. This p.m., Lizzie, Fanny, and Georgie went to the afternoon tea at Mrs. Blood's High Street home. Sarah Chase also went. She went to the beach this a.m. and met the girls on High Street. It is a fine, cool day with the wind from the east. The Ridgways called tonight. So this was leisurely living, I would say, if that's juxtaposed against working in a mill. August 3rd, it is a rainy day, but cleared about noon, so that I picked blackberries in the garden. Tonight, Fanny and Georgie and Sarah Chase and Sam have gone over to call on Miss Louisa and Miss Eleanor Poor. Agnes and others called at the gate. So there was a lot of visiting going on. I guess August 5th, this sounds like Sunday, Sam took Sarah Chase to church, and Joe, Mother, Louie, Fanny, we all went to St. Paul's Church in Newburyport. Teresa came home early. I have called on Miss Kirsten this PM. It was a charming day. The girls and Sam went to the burying ground to play later in the afternoon. And I would mention St. Paul's Church in Newburyport on High Street was actually a different church at that time. I went to a art display by Richard Burke-Jones last Saturday at the Maritime Museum, where I am the outreach historian. And he does historic paintings, and he had one of High Street as it looked in the 1850s. And the church today looks very old, and I would think most people would think it does come from the 19th century. But actually, the St. Paul's Church on High Street was built in 1926 after, and this was our initial theme, after there was a fire. The stone building to the left survived that fire, and so that part goes back to the 19th century. But it's interesting, the church was rebuilt in 1926. It's not a century old yet, but it certainly seems like it's been part of the community forever. And here are a couple more things. August 6th, Sarah arose at 2 o'clock, and when we went, we did the washing, and it was a large amount to do, so we had a tiresome day. Miss Kirsten called after tea, and Sarah Chase spent the day at the Ridgeways, and Sam went up for her at night. And then we had a large mowing the next day, a churning day as well. It was warm, and we got tired. And so I hope they will prove satisfactory. We're a little concerned about the weather coming up. Now this is what I like. I haven't seen this before since I'm a great tennis fan and a tennis player. This is August 8th, 1894. Sam is at home today, and the girls are to have a tennis party at 4 o'clock. Philip has already arrived, and they've gone to the tennis court. I suppose the others will be there soon. I wonder where that tennis court is. I mean, now we have 3 at Atkinson Common, as we know. There are a couple that are kind of gone at Knock Middle School. I mean, they were tennis courts. They're in sad shape now. There are, of course, 6 indoor courts on Low Street. But I thought it was interesting, and an interesting juxtaposition when we think about young women in Lawrence and Lowell working full days, 6 days a week, and trying to get better pay and better working conditions. And you have a different segment of society over in Newburyport, and again, it's 1894, doing a lot of visiting, a lot of berry picking, a lot of playing tennis, for that matter. I wonder if any of those mill girls knew what tennis was. But I was very intrigued to see the word tennis. And it is my want to try to talk about women in history. And so, again, I think I've mentioned them a couple times, but a little later in our history, Newburyport history, 2 amazing women lived in town. One was named Anna Jakes. She was here from 1827 to 1911. She was a single woman, had about $22,000 to her name, which is quite a bit of money in the 1902 or so. And she earmarked that money for a medical facility. That is the one on Highland Avenue now. Of course, it is a medical center. Many of us go there. It has grown tremendously in the past 2 decades, especially. It employs over 1,000 people. But that was a woman who started that, Anna Jakes. And there was another famous woman, Emma Lander Andrews, was a teacher here in Newburyport and co-founder of the South End Reading Room. And in 1905, she bequeathed the house at the corner of Purchase and Marlborough Streets to be purchased by people interested in reading and helping youngsters. In those days, not everyone got to read. I imagine in 1905, not everyone went to school. But Miss Emma Lander Andrews wanted young people to be able to read and get books. And we still have that. I think, people who live in town will know exactly where that is. And one of my favorite women from that period of time was Euphemia Vale Smith. She was a great historian known as Mrs. E. Vale Smith. In 1854, she wrote The History of Newburyport, from the earliest settlement of the country to the present. And it's really a great book. She talks about many of the people of the day. And Caleb Cushing, as we've discussed before, did become the first mayor in 1851. And another famous woman of the day, Harriet Prescott Spofford, she lived from 1835 to 1921. She was a writer who attained national prominence. Publications that carried her work included the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's Bazaar. She was a resident of Deer Island, and she wrote numerous elements for magazines, and she also wrote a non-piece called Newburyport and Its Neighborhoods. So that's, a very famous woman, famous at the day, but, we don't talk as much about women, although clearly I am trying to do so. Another key woman of the last century was Martha Wheelwright, 1804 to 1888. She was a philanthropist and longtime supporter of the Society for the Relief of Aged Females. There is until last half dozen years ago, there was a structure on High Street, one of the most beautiful on High Street, that was dedicated to aged women. Now, the organization still exists, but that facility has been turned into a a health care facility, and for extended care. But they still help aged women. They still try to come along and make it possible for women without money can get by. This isn't her largest achievement, but this is notable. She was married to William Wheelwright, a businessman, and they spent much of their time in Panama, Chile, and other countries. He was really well known in South America and was one of the leaders and one of the wealthiest men in South America. And some of that money came back to Newburyport. Ethel Parton, 1862 to 1944, was a journalist and author. Now, I like that word, journalist. I was with the Daily News for 6 years, and before that with the Portland Press Herald, the Boston Herald, the Boston Business Journal, and, of course, the local paper. And this is Life Along the Merrimack. We're talking about the river, the fires, and now we're talking about some prominent women who made their mark here in Newburyport. Ethel Parton wrote a half a dozen books about growing up in Newburyport, including Melissa Ann, The Last Locket, and The House Between. And she also published several novels, including The Mule and The Parthenon and Year Without Summer. She's an early suffragist and the first woman to serve on the board of directors of the Newburyport Public Library. So that's interesting to know. Dr. Abby Noyes Little, 1872 to 1952, was the only female physician of Newburyport to go abroad during service during World War I. And, we tend to forget what a huge event World War I was. And many men from the community went there. It lasted from 1914 to 1918, of course. The U.S. didn't get in until about 1916. But many men from this area did go over. And, some did well. Some, became wounded and injured. And so this is an interesting thing that Dr. Abby Noyes Little did go over there. And one of her remarks, and she just talked about how it was so difficult, and she tried to work right on the field and help people out. So those are a couple things I wanted to mention. This is Life Along the Merrimack. I am host Dyke Hendrickson. I am with the Custom House Maritime Museum as Outreach Director. I won't be here next week talking about South America like the Wheelwrights. I'll be in South America, in Colombia, at my son's wedding. So I won't be here next week. But please listen in again in 2 weeks, and we'll talk about Life Along the Merrimack. Thank you very much.